actually made real the Declaration of Independence.
The power and influence of this House.
Mécanique supérieure.
The host of the nations of the world on our own soil.
Bem-vindos à Sociedade das Nações, um programa semanal sobre a atualidade internacional aqui na SIC Noticias. Numa altura de decisão eleitoral nos Estados Unidos, é importante também perceber o que é que pensam os grandes deste planeta sobre esse resultado. E um dos grandes continua a ser a Rússia, e estamos hoje em território russo, na Embaixada da Rússia em Lisboa, com A.K.Pушkov, o presidente do Comiteta de Relações Internacionais da Duma russa ao Parlamento, e vamos falar precisamente sobre como é que a Rússia olha o processo eleitoral americano. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Lisbon.
Thank you.
Do you think that the elections in the United States, either Romney or Obama, are going to change the global outlook of the bilateral relation with Russia?
Well, they definitely may. Unlike Mr. Obama, who started a reset policy with Russia, Mr. Romney declared that Russia is the geopolitical foe number one of the United States. Then actually he corrected himself in a way. He said that Russia is a foe but not an enemy. But to tell you the truth, in Moscow, people still think he said enemy.
It gets lost in translation.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And that's actually the starting point in our assessment of Mr. Romney. So, in a way, Mr. Romney set himself the tonality of our potential dialogue. And definitely, after these words, all the responsible politicians in Moscow would prefer Obama to be elected.
So I'll get that Russians are not going to vote on Mr. Romney.
Russians would not go on Mr. Obama neither. It's up to the Americans to make their choice. But definitely we would like to have a complicated partner, because Mr. Obama is a partner. We have some complications.
Yes.
But still partnership does exist on some issues. Then to have a clear-cut enemy number one.
But if you look in the past, if you look through the era of Gorbachev, before and after, I mean, there was one thing which was rhetoric and another thing which was the reality, the harsh reality of bilateral relations. Do you think that rhetoric will play the important role, or there are other important things to be dealt with?
Rhetoric does play a role. When Mr. Bush Jr. came to power after Bill Clinton in the United States, we had for half a year a kind of imitation of the rhetorical Cold War we used to have with the United States in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And it did not work very well at the very beginning. Then Putin and Bush met in Ljubljana in Slovenia, and a dialogue started. But the beginning was very harsh. So what I think is that today Mr. Romney does not fully understand what is international politics about. I think he does not understand how the United States can provide any kind of efficient foreign policy. And he doesn't see that in order to get results, the United States have to get the cooperation not only of their allies, but also of important countries like Russia, like China, like India, like South Africa, Brazil, some others. When he understands this, I think we will get back to realpolitik, to the real politics. But it may take time. It may take time.
As you know, Mr. Romney and Mr. Obama, they are products of larger forces in American history. I mean, economic forces, social forces, political forces, military forces. They are not, let's say, only them. There is also a shadow behind them. Do you think that in economics, in politics, in the military realm, the relations between Moscow and Washington are today full of common goals, or the goals are totally different and apart?
Well, we have some interests that do coincide. I would say both countries are interested to assure the regime of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons.
One.
We think that we can cooperate on Afghanistan. Basically, nobody wants Afghanistan to get back to some kind of radical Islamist regime, although I'm pretty skeptical about the results of this cooperation. I think that when the US decide to leave in 2014, we probably will have to deal with a new Taliban government. But still, it's an area where we can cooperate. I think we should cooperate more on climate issues. A lot depends here on such big, large economies as the American economy and the Russian economy. We can theoretically cooperate on the issue of terrorism. I'm saying theoretically because everybody says so. But those who are considered terrorists in Russia very often are considered to be freedom fighters in the United States.
That's an old problem, as you know.
That's an old problem.
We still don't have a universal definition of terrorism.
Well, we do agree. Both of us, we do agree that Al-Qaeda is a terroristic organization, but when it comes to Syria, things get more complicated. When there is an explosion in Damascus, the United States don't want to condemn it, although in Moscow people think it is a terrorist act. So it's not easy. Unfortunately, on a number of issues, like European security, like the future of NATO, like the anti-ballistic missile system, and quite a few other things, we have very different standpoints with the United States. And I'm afraid that with Mr. Romney, it will be impossible to solve those issues. With Mr. Obama...
Impossible?
Impossible. With Mr. Obama, I hope...
You are kind of very pessimistic about...
No,
I recall one of your remarks about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist, but you are very pessimistic about the Romney presidency.
As I said in my remark, a pessimist is a well-informed optimist.
Yes.
You know? So I'm afraid I'm well-informed about Mr. Romney.
You are?
And the circles he represents.
You are more informed than the Americans about him.
I think that I can detect behind Mr. Romney a very serious, very important trend in American politics. And this is the trend which was represented by Bush, by Rumsfeld, by Cheney, by McCain, by this kind of people who think that America is not the outstanding leader of the world just for one reason, because there is not enough political will. And they accuse Obama of weakness. But the point is not Obama's weakness. The point is American new weakness.
I think the body of political thought in the United States today recognizes that America is not anymore the totally dominant power in the world, and there are limitations to its power.
Still we see these politicians who struggle for maintaining this complete dominance of the United States. And I'm afraid, as I say, Mr. Romney will have to learn. But the first year may really be very difficult, and that's why I'm pessimistic.
Tell me one thing. We need to tango. Let's talk now about Russia itself. I mean, what you say to critics that say that Russia, with Mr. Putin, with all the political liberalism that we are hearing, and the parties and freedom of expression, what you say to critics that say that under that, there is really a new authoritarian power growing in Russia?
Look, I always maintained, before I was in the parliament, when I'm in the parliament, I didn't change my position.
You were never a full member of the party, right?
No, I'm not member of the party. I'm an independent who ran on the list of United Russia, which is the leading party on Russia. And there are quite a few members of parliament, independents, who ran on the list of this party. So my position is that Russia is a country with democratic institutions and authoritarian political culture. And things like political culture, they do not change overnight.
Yeah.
You know, we had a very long period of our history when we had absolute monarch, the Tsars. Then we had an absolute monarch, it was the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Yeah. And then we have a president now. Yes, now we have democratic institutions, but the role of the president is still a role of a person number one in a largely authoritarian society. And by the way, Boris Yeltsin, who was sometimes depicted as a Democrat, he was not a Democrat, he was anti-communist, but he was quite authoritarian. So there is a difference between being anti-communist and being a Democrat, and I think you know this in Portugal.
Right.
Yes, so I would say that this will take time to change. But if you
And also, to
compare
be a
today,
Democrat is not a certificate of
No.
of goodwill and of good behavior.
absolutely not. Absolutely not. But if you compare today's Russia to the Soviet Union or to China, for instance,
Right.
it's a completely different country. Of course, you have all the institutions, you have different points of views, you have real debates in the parliament, you have real political opposition. You can see it in the streets of Moscow from time to time, but you can also see it in the parliament. You can have situations when Mr. Putin is speaking in the parliament and there is a whole faction standing up, and in a protest they leave the audience. It doesn't happen in an authoritarian society. So it's a mixture.
Yeah.
As I say, democratic institutions with authoritarian political
Do you think that the
traditions.
case of the punk group, the Pussy Riot, was exaggerated by the media? Do you think it's a real issue in America, in Russia culture? Do you think it represents something? I mean, because as you know, there are people that say, well, you should give freedom of expression and then deal with that through the courts. Other people say it should not be a political issue; it should be only a civil, civil suit. I mean,
we get mixed signals from Europe.
even Mr. Medvedev expressed apparently some different views on the issue. But
Well, this is his personal opinion,
Yeah.
but the court decided
Yeah.
to sentence them for 2 years of colony. My personal feeling is that the Pussy Riot in Russia was not considered to be an affair of a punishment for freedom of expression. It was punishment for a violation of the religious feelings, for an offense against religious feelings of dozens of millions of people, because Russia is an Orthodox
Right.
country, and about 50-60 million people say that they are Orthodox believers.
And you think that it made any difference, the fact that some of the members of the group said that they didn't want to offend anyone from the point of view of religion? They only wanted
but
to
they
make
didn't.
a
They didn't
political
offer.
statement.
They didn't offer a kind of official apology. They say, well, they say we're sorry, something, but it was kind
Right.
of, it was really a lip service, I would say, and so they did not convince the public. Actually, two of them convinced the public that they are really serious about this, and from Europe we get mixed signals. Some people say us, you have to deal with it through the courts. Then we deal through the court. The court.
But then they say the courts are not
no, that's
working.
too much.
Because then they say the courts are not working properly.
Come on, look.
in Russia.
It's
Do you think your courts are working properly?
Well,
Are you happy with your judicial system?
No, I'm not. I'm not. And I think that there is a dependence on the courts, on the executive, and on the bureaucracy. But on this very case, I think that there were quite a few people who would say they should have been sentenced for 5 years, not 2 years.
Right.
So I think the court has taken a kind of decision in the middle of the spectrum, between 0 and
Right.
5 or 6 years. And there is not a lot of sympathy to pussy rights in Russia, with the exception of some marginal liberal groups, mostly in Moscow and in St. Petersburg and big cities. The more far away you go from the capitals, the more radical the public opinion is.
Let's return to the bilateral relation and let's talk about Syria for a while. I mean, we know what divides the United States and Russia on Syria, some of the elements you talked. Tell me something that unites you and the United States in Syria. Is there any common interest?
Well, the common interest was fixed in the Geneva communique that was signed in Geneva on June 27, and which called for bringing the two sides together to some kind of negotiation.
Do you think there are only two sides?
Well, basically, for the time being, there are two sides. I mean, those who are pro-Assad and against
And
Assad.
it makes it much more simple. I thought you would say it's a much more complex situation than two sides.
No. I think there are two sides, but the situation is complex because the countries who have officially supported the Geneva communique, they actually are not doing anything to bring the military opposition to the table of negotiation. My feeling would be that we should find people who would be acceptable for those negotiations on the side of the government, and people who would be acceptable on the side of the opposition. But the problem is that, for instance, take the United States, signing by one hand these agreements. By the other hand, they are offering political support, and basically they back politically, the financial and military support which is being sent to the military opposition from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from those countries of the Persian Gulf. And by this, they subvert the whole meaning of this communique. You know, you cannot say, we want negotiation, but then you support one of the sides and you tell them, you will win, we are supporting you. So nobody will sit to the negotiation table. And this prevents us from exercising our influence in Damascus, say on Assad, because Assad tells us, but these guys don't want any kind of negotiation. So Russia is very often taken to be responsible for this. But like somebody said recently, there should be two people to dance a tango, you know. So we cannot say to Assad, you should go to the negotiation table, or your people should go to this table, if the other guys are just fighting all the time.
It's not only two people to dance a tango. Both have to be good dancers, because if not, it's embarrassing.
Well, no. In Syria today, everybody is a lousy dancer.
But tell me one thing. On Syria still, one case can be made for the need to protect people that are being killed and don't have weapons. And there are two ways of protecting them, or either giving them weapons or giving them soldiers to protect them. I mean, do you favor any remote form of international intervention in Syria?
We only know the forms of interventions that we have seen in Libya, in Iraq, and we don't think that...
So you need a new one, right?
Yes. We don't think those are humanitarian interventions. We think those are about geopolitics. And actually, they have devastated both countries. They have not made these countries better. They have made them worse, in a way. Even under the worst days of Saddam Hussein, you know, there was not so many innocent people dying in the streets of Baghdad, sure? And I'm absolutely sure. I'm absolutely sure. 200,000 people died for 10 years. We had here
Sheikh Omar Hakim, that is one of the leaders of the Shiite community, and he said, before it was much worse, but no one knew, and because there was no publicity of the massacres that were occurring.
It can be explained by the fact that the Shia now are ruling Iraq. So
but there was a war of national liberation in Iraq, besides an American invasion.
Yes.
You never reconciled yourself with that?
No. Personally, I think it was a receipt for having a civil war in Iraq. You know, this American occupation on Iraq led Iraq to a civil war. And look what is going on in Libya. I've been in Libya in the times of Gaddafi. It was basically getting close to the Emirates in a way. It was an affluent society. Now it's all destroyed. It's demolished. And they say it's democracy. I don't see democracy. I see American diplomats being killed. I see what goes on in Bani Walid now, where there is a rebellion which is put down by the authorities. So I think it's a receipt for civil war, all those interventions from the West. But today, there is not even anybody who is ready for such an intervention. The Americans don't want, NATO is not ready, the Saudis and Qatar, they can brag about themselves, but they can do nothing. And so they are demolishing this country by supporting this civil war, and that's the problem.
One interesting factor is a country that we didn't mention, which is Israel. Although Russia has maintained good relations with Iran, with a grain of salt, of course, always applying some pressure to Iran, you also have maintained good relation with Israel. There was a big state visit of the Israeli Prime Minister to Russia with lots of businessmen, defense analysts.
Recently, Mr. Putin in July
and Mr. Putin
was in Israel.
They were both like talking about contracts, about lots of things. Do you think that this relation with Israel will be substantially important to alter the geopolitical tension between Israel and Iran?
I think that on Iran, Russia is listening to some Israeli concerns. For instance, as far as I know, we declined to give Iran the C-300 anti-air missile systems, which are extremely efficient and which can prevent any kind of air military strikes from Iran, although the Iranians were very interested to get it, but we refused. So I think it was taken very positively in Israel. But then, of course, there is a big difference between Russian position and Israel on Iran. Israel is considering a military strike. We think that the military strike against Iran first will lead to a very large war in this area, and second will not prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. In fact, this is a guarantee that Iran will become nuclear if they strike it. Because after this, Iran will have all the rationale, all the explanations. You know, we have been aggressed.
What is the point of view of Russia? You know political power in Russia, you know the military. What's the view on Iran? I mean, do you think that they are having a military side
We are worried.
of a program? Or,
Yeah,
or not?
we are worried with the prospect of Iran getting a nuclear weapon for the evident reason that it becomes the region more dangerous, not less dangerous. Because we can see a situation when Turkey might become interested. You know, it can start a chain reaction.
Proliferation again.
Yes, proliferation, exactly. That's why we're very worried. But on the other hand, the question is, what do we do? And are we going to war against Iran in order to prevent it from getting nuclear? And our answer is no. And you remember how many calls there were when Pakistan was doing a nuclear weapon. People were saying that the next day there will be a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan. And so. But in fact, the situation has become better, not worse. In a way, the nuclear weapons plays a role of a containing weapon. So we think that definitely there should be no war. We don't like the prospect of Iran being nuclear. If you wish, that's the two sides of the Russian position.
But you think that a nuclear Russia can live with a nuclear Iran?
We may have to accept this, like everybody accepted nuclear Pakistan, and are getting ready to even to nuclear Northern Korea. Although here, by the way, you asked me before what we have in common with the United States, for instance. We have a very close position on the nuclear weapons in North Korea. That's where we agree.
I bid you a good farewell to Moscow, and I hope that if Mr. Romney gets elected, that we can tape a new program.
With pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.